Hello, thank you for listening to my presentation for our Mythical Nature entitled Mythical Skyscapes, Constellation Myths and Educational Picture Books. Let me begin. Ancient Greco-Roman constellation myths are still an important tool in modern astronomy. They are the basis of modern international star maps and shape the way that we conceptualize the night sky. Their enduring significance is reflected in children's educational media. There are a number of English illustrated children's books about constellation myths aimed at primary school children ages 5 through 12. The aim of such books is to prime young readers for the practical study of astronomy, mainly looking at the stars through telescopes. At the same time, these books enculturate their readers into seeing the cultural landscape of the night sky, defining their relationship to the universe. The night sky cannot be called a landscape in the literal sense, but it can be defined as a cultural landscape, a landscape that has been altered by human intervention. The term is applied not only to physical landscapes that have been impacted by human occupation, but to humanity's perception of physical landscapes. Mount Olympus itself is an excellent example. The mountain's mythical role overshadows its considerable ecological significance in the minds of people across the globe. A starry night sky fits the definition of a cultural landscape to a far greater extent than any geological landscape on Earth. As a natural space, human impact on the sky is statistically insignificant. Our hands cannot reach the stars. However, our sky is quite literally a natural space that only exists through the stories that humans tell themselves. The universe is perceived from the surface of the planet is actually a vast emptiness stretching out across 4 dimensions. The objects that we see are expanding outward in all directions from a central point at incomprehensible speeds and are so far away that the very light by which we perceive their existence can take thousands of years to reach our eyes. In truth, there is nothing cohesive about the night sky, not even what we see. The closest star visible in the northern hemisphere, Sirius, is a mere 8.6 light years away. So the light from it that reaches human eyes on Earth is only 8.6 years old. The furthest star that is visible to the naked eye is Rho Cassiopeiae, which is nearly 500 times further away than Sirius. Looking from one to the other, a person standing on the earth is looking at objects as they were 8.5 years and 4,000 years ago in the same glance. There is nothing unified about the points of light scattered across the night sky, except that people on earth perceive their light at the same time. Therefore, the night sky is only a skyscape because humans perceive it as such. Since ancient times, humans across the globe have imagined that the night sky is not an inky void stretching out infinite lengths back to the dawn of time, but a series of sparkling dots projected on a smooth surface of a dome above our heads, the visible half of a celestial sphere enfolding the earth. No, not content with this constructed unity, ancient peoples drew imaginary lines between the stars to populate the sky with mythical heroes, objects, and monsters. These figures did not exist in isolation. Many of them were part of interstellar murals telling myths that began on Earth with heroic deeds and ended in the sky as new constellations, overlaying ancient religious beliefs and cultural narratives onto space. Their own identity was reflected back at them every night, reinforcing their place within the cosmos. A cultural landscape of the sky, or rather a cultural skyscape in the truest sense of the term. From ancient times until today, humans have used these cultural narratives to map the sky. As science became increasingly globalized, Greek mythology came to be embedded into the international astronomical classifications. The myths that weave the stars together into a mappable skyscape are most English speaking children's first point of entry into navigating the night sky. Because they are narratives, they are conceptually easier and far more accessible than the most basic mechanics of astrophysics. While such books do often touch on the basics of astronomy, they also seek to establish a relationship between the reader and humanity's common identity through the medium of the cultural skyscape. In many ways, these books are enculturation tools. They give children a sense of who they are relative to the larger universe and to humanity's shared past. The process is twofold. First, these books use myths to connect the sky into a communal cultural landscape. Then they locate the reader as the viewer of the cultural landscape, centering the ancient mythological narratives around the reader's consumption of them. By seeing the myths in the night sky, the child reader becomes the linchpin that connects the past to the present, the individual stars to the holistic sky, and the astrophysical to the universal. There are many collections of constellation myths aimed at young readers. This presentation will use just 5 as example texts to illustrate how mythical skyscapes are constructed in Anglophone texts published in North America and the United Kingdom. My example texts are all recent, produced in a 20-year period between 1998 and 2018. However, I will make brief reference to Dallaire's Book of Greek Myths by Ingrid and Edgar Perrin Dallaire from 1962. Although the book is not specifically a collection of constellation myths, it remains the single most influential collection of Greek mythology for children in North America. It is generally marketed to children at the upper end of the target age group, between ages 8 and 12. Zoo in the Sky, a book of animal constellations, published in 1998, and Once Upon a Starry Night, a book of constellations, published in 2003, both written by Jacqueline Mitten and illustrated by Christina Ballet, are a set of 2 books produced by National Geographic. The series was published simultaneously in the United States and the United Kingdom. The books are marketed for readers on the younger end of my age spectrum, ages 6 to 9. Sarah Gillingham's Seeing Stars, a complete guide to the 88 constellation, and Kelsey Osiad's What We See in the Stars, an illustrated tour of the night sky, take the most astronomical approach of all of my example texts. Both were published in the United States and both offer constellation catalogs rather than mythical narratives. As its title promises, Gillingham's Seeing Stars focuses on the 88 constellations recognized by the International Astronomical Union. But Osiad's What We See in the Stars expands its scope to encompass a number of important historical and scientific astronomical topics. The books are aimed at slightly older children within my target age group and were published in 2018 and 2017, respectively. Alison Davis's Written in the Stars, Constellation, Facts, and Folklore, published in London in 2018, is also a constellation catalog, but it emphasizes the stories behind the constellations rather than their astronomical features. It is marketed to children ages 8 through 11, and it was first published in the UK. And now, Mapping Out the Sky. All of these children's books of constellation myths begin by introducing the night sky as a cohesive whole. Readers are presented with a unifying metaphor of some kind. Usually these metaphors evoke play in the form of toys or games. The 2 more scientific mythic collections, Gillingham and Osiad, rely on well-established metaphors. Osiad introduces her book with Anaximenes' idea of the celestial sphere, although she does not cite him by name. Gillingham describes constellations as bright stars that form pictures when imaginary lines are drawn between them. She says it's like playing a game of connect the dots in the sky. Like Gillingham, Davis adopts a metaphor out of common children's play. She says, each pattern of stars slots together like pieces of a gigantic jigsaw puzzle. This metaphor not only established the night sky as a unified whole, it places the agency for creating the whole in the hands of the child reader, the puzzle master. Her night sky is explicitly a cultural landscape that readers construct through their perception of it. The strongest examples by far come from the two books aimed at the youngest readers. Zoo in the Sky has its establishing metaphor in its title. However, the first page, here at the top, introduces a second metaphor that is drawn from play. It says that at night, the sky turns into a picture puzzle. The phrase picture puzzle is occasionally used to describe a jigsaw puzzle, but the subsequent rhetorical question, what is hiding in the patterns of the stars, suggests another type of children's game that is also known as hidden pictures. The game takes the form of a busy image with instructions to find certain objects in the image. Zoo in the Sky's introduction finishes with its titular metaphor, informing the readers that sky watchers long ago imagined a whole zoo of animals in the sky's picture puzzle. Although the illustrated animals on the page might correspond to the constellations, to certain constellations, the stars inside do not match their counterparts. The visual illustrates the metaphor, not the actual night sky. Zoo in the Sky's companion volume, Once Upon a Starry Night, here below, uses a metatextual unifying metaphor and also reinforces it with a larger illustration. This night sky is not just stars, but a vast picture book. Once again, the metaphor invokes something specific to children's entertainment. Once the unified cultural landscape is established as a playground for the reader's minds, the authors present constellation myths with an emphasis on their interrelated elements. I will use the constellation group from the Perseus myth as a case study: Perseus, Andromeda, Cassiopeia, Cephalus, Cetus, and Pegasus. Gillingham and Ossian devote the least space to mythical narratives, but both authors still use mythical connections to define a unified skyscape. I'll start with Gillingham. Gillingham tells her myths quickly, but highlights the relationships between the character constellations. She particularly points out that those relationships are reflected in the sky, and that fact facilitates the process of finding individual constellations at night. She writes, Perseus sits in the sky beside his love Andromeda, whom he later married, and close to other characters from his life story, such as Cassiopeia and Cephalus. Gillingham also notes that Andromeda's brightest star, Alphatraz, is part of the great square of the constellation Pegasus. And then she chooses to recount a medieval variation of the myth, popularized by the 1981 version of Clash of the Titans, that includes Pegasus as part of the Perseus story. Andromeda was chained to the rock as a sacrifice, but just before the sea monster gobbled her up, a kind hero, Perseus, killed the monster and unchained Andromeda. And then the two rode away on the winged horse Pegasus. Ossian also calls attention to the interconnections between constellation narratives, albeit more subtly. She uses white text to narrate the myths, but the names of important astronomical features, mostly related constellation names, are in a bold light blue font. Furthermore, Ossian notes thematic connections that link groups of constellations. Not only does she inform the readers of Cetus's narrative associations with Andromeda, Cassiopeia, and Perseus, she ends the passage with the fact that Cetus is located in a section of the sky called the sea, because it is full of constellations that have aquatic themes. Aquarius, the water bearer, Delphinus, the dolphin, and Arindonus, the river. The more story-oriented books link constellations into larger patchwork of sky by telling stories that describe groups, not single constellations. Mitton's Once Upon a Starry Night describes each constellation in the Perseus group as if it was the mythical character acting out an overarching story. The text for Perseus reads, Perseus to the rescue. Winged sandals on his feet, the hero speeds through the Milky Way to Andromeda's side. So Andromeda was saved, and bold Perseus married his princess. As promised in its initial metaphor, the text turns the sky itself into an illustration of the myth of Perseus and Andromeda, blurring the lines between space and myth. Davies's Written in the Stars is by far the strongest example of the phenomenon. She organizes the myths by groups named after their most prominent constellations. Davies begins her Perseus section with Cassiopeia, the most visually prominent of the constellations in the group. She introduces Cassiopeia first by her social status and most prominent character traits, then by her relationship to the other constellations. The stunning yet arrogant Queen Cassiopeia was married to King Kephis of Ethiopia. The text then references two other constellations, Andromeda and Cetus. Cassiopeia's caption sets up the Andromeda myth scenario. Cassiopeia's boasting, Poseidon's anger, and Kephis's choice to sacrifice his daughter to the sea monster Cetus. Each subsequent constellation in the group adds to the narrative. Kephis's paragraph assures the reader that the story will end happily with Andromeda rescued by the hero Perseus. Andromeda's text adds detail to the rescue, namely that Perseus agreed to rescue Andromeda for her hand in marriage, and that his fight with the monster was a great battle. It concludes with the fact that the two had 7 children. The description of Perseus circles back to add the story of Medusa's slaying to the narrative, and the next text associated with the Pegasus, continues the story, the Medusa story, with the winged horse's birth from her severed neck. And now, stellar connections. In spite of the fact that children's collections of constellation myths characterize the skyscape as a transcendent space, the books do not present the space as beyond reach. Instead, the mythical skyscape is an avenue that allows the reader access to a multicultural world and to all times past and present. Gillingham says in her introductory letter to the reader, when looking up at the stars, I like to think that all of the other people who have looked up at the same sky over time imagine a zillion tiny lines connecting us all, just like the lines that connect our stars to create constellations. The result is not unlike the temporal palimpsest model proposed by Nelson and Morey in their 2019 edited volume, Topologies of the Classical World in Children's Fiction, Palimpsest Maps and Fractal. The texts construct the sky as a constant, and the cultural landscape of the sky as viewed by the child readers bridges the temporal plane between the present moment and the space-time continuum. D'Aulaire's Book of Greek Myth is one of the best examples of the phenomenon. It is a general collection of Greek mythology that loosely follows Hesiod's Theogony, not a collection of star myths explicitly. However, the authors do indicate any constellations that result from the myths that the book recounts. The last page of D'Aulaire's ends with the mythical skyscape. It reads, everything must come to an end, and so did the rule of Zeus and the other Olympian gods. All that is left of their glory on earth are broken temples and noble statues. Also the muses fell silent, but their songs lived on to this very day, and the constellations put up by the gods still glitter on the dark blue vault of the sky. D'Aulaire's final illustration reiterates its final message. It is a full 2-page landscape in line drawing against a brown background that evokes old parchment. The page with the text shows a bare landscape with a broken sculpture fragment and the head of an archaic Zeus in the foreground. But the facing page continues the landscape into a night sky filled with sketched images of the constellations circling Polaris. The constellation map is accurately drafted, with the brightest stars correctly positioned and each figure labeled. The book takes child readers from the abstract creation of the earth, Gaia, and the sky, Uranus, in olden times, to an actual experience that child readers might have within their own physical landscape. The other example texts draw on the same connection between the ancient past and the child reader's present. These texts explicitly position the reader as the viewer. As mentioned above, Gillingham's introduction takes the form of a letter addressed to the reader. Dear reader, it begins, as you will learn in this book, a constellation is a group of bright stars that forms a picture when the imaginary lines are drawn between the stars to connect them. These pictures in the sky have inspired people to tell stories about constellations for thousands of years. In other words, it is explicitly the cultural landscape that telescopes time, and storytelling, no matter which story, is the shared experience. Mitten's 2 books are written in the second person. They pose rhetorical questions to readers to encourage them to connect the constellation myths to their own personal experiences. Before she tells the story of Asclepius, Mitten contextualizes Ophiuchus, the serpent bearer, by asking readers, is it dangerous to hold a snake? Although such questions do not explicitly connect the viewer to the past, they do encourage the reader to see their own experiences in the cultural landscape created by these ancient myths. Ossiad's introduction is more direct. It is literally titled What We See in the Stars. The book begins, for most of human history, our understanding of the cosmos was based not on scientific evidence, but on our direct observations of the night sky as we gazed up at its sparkling dark expanse. To take a moment and gaze up is to connect to an ancient human experience. It can be a great source of wonder and awe. Ossiad's use of the first person plural makes stargazing a universal human experience that child readers share. They are part of a group that includes the author and every other human being in a single unbroken continuum. Davy says in the first paragraph of her introduction, in the moment when you catch a glimpse of a special group or pattern of stars in the veil of the sky, for a second you see what the ancients saw. Then you appreciate the magnificence of the universe, and you're taken far back into the annals of time. Davis creates the connection between the past and the present through the act of recognition. Child readers do not just engage in shared action with the humans of the past, they engage in a shared cognitive process. They recognize the same patterns that turn the sky from the inky chaos of space into the exact same cultural landscape that the ancient Greeks saw. Fundamentally, Davis's cultural landscape is fourth dimensional. She takes the analogy a step further, making the exchange of gazes mutual. She says, let's not forget the stars have seen all of the life on Earth unfold beneath them. Like eyes blinking and watching, these tiny, enduring beads of light witness and hold our stories and memories long after we are gone. Child viewers and the stars themselves create a dialogue of gazing that gives viewers access to all of the history that the stars themselves have witnessed. It establishes the child readers as the entities that give the universe meaning. The stars are silent witnesses to history. It is through their engagement with child viewers that they can testify to the passage of time. Child readers' recognition of the constellations and recognition of their stories gives the constellation a voice to share their stories. In closing, I would like to quote the final verse of the song Yakko's Universe from that seminal children's cartoon of the 1990s, The Animaniacs. These lines perfectly distill the ideological relationship between the skyscape and the child readers that rests at the heart of all collections of children's star myths. It's a great big universe, and we're all really puny. We're just tiny little specks about the size of Mickey Rooney. Though we don't know how it got here, we're an important part here. It's a big universe, and it's ours.